Managing secure access to cloud resources is getting more complex, and a misconfiguration can easily turn into a major breach. That's why there's Teleport. Teleport is the easiest, most secure way to access your cloud infrastructure. The open source Teleport Access Plane consolidates everything you need for secure access to your Windows and Linux servers, Kubernetes clusters, databases, and internal applications like AWS Management Console, Jenkins, GitLab, Grafana, and much more. Teleport's unique approach is not only more secure, it also improves developer productivity. Download Teleport today at goteleport.com/cloudcast. That's goteleport.com/cloudcast.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. We are getting very close to the end of February 2022, and lots going on in the world. Sometimes some things good, some things not so great, but hope everybody is doing well. Another Sunday perspective show. Glad to be with you. I want to dive into a topic that I don't know that we've covered some things around lessons learned. And I was listening to a podcast. Well, a couple of things kind of connected the dots for me this week. As many of you know, if you follow Kubernetes, if you're around the Kubernetes community, there was a two-part documentary series, a two-part sort of movie, if you will, that came out from the CNCF, was sponsored by the CNCF and a couple of sort of the early people involved with Kubernetes. And it was kind of a history of Kubernetes, right? How did it get started? Where are we today? And it involved a number of the people who were there in the very, very earliest days. And one of the things that was interesting to me, so the documentary itself was interesting. If you were part of the Kubernetes community, sometimes it's good to sort of go back and relive, how we got to where we are today in terms of, this thing that started as a couple of people trying to, create a, what's the best word for it? Kind of a replica of a service internal to Google that was very, very useful called Borg, became Kubernetes, how the process became open source, how the foundation, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation was created, and, how Kubernetes went in there, and kind of the whole process of how it went from a very Google-centric thing to a lot of different companies and developers being involved. And so that part was interesting. The other part that was interesting is, as we've had Brandon from Software Defined Talk on the show. Our friends over there, those guys do a great job. If you're into podcasts, if you best way to think about it is if you take Cloud News of the Week and turn it into a full podcast, is a lot of what the Brandon, Matt Ray, and Cote do. Plus, they dive into a whole bunch of other topics. But what was interesting was they were kind of reviewing the video series, and one of the topics that came up, and if you listen to the show, you've heard him talk about it before. Cote sort of said, look, and he's very good at focusing on sort of, the developer side of things, right? Not so much the infrastructure side of things, but the developer side of things. And he sort of kept asking this question. He said, it doesn't make sense to me still necessarily why Kubernetes ended up being successful. Because at the end of the day, if you look at the most basic concepts of what Kubernetes was trying to do, yes, it was trying to, find a way to orchestrate containers, but it was ultimately designed to, to help build cloud native applications, right? Create an experience for developers that would make it easier to build cloud native applications. And, he sort of came back and he said, well, that's all well and good. And that's a great goal. But, if you look at Kubernetes today and you look at it by any measure, by, lots of different commercial offerings that are out there, the open source offerings that are out there, it still doesn't have a great developer experience. And in fact, it doesn't have sort of one well-defined sort of canonical developer experience. And so, he kind of posed the question of like, if that's the case, was this Kubernetes thing really just about, how to orchestrate containers, which doesn't really serve a distinct business function if the applications aren't there? And how did it get so successful if it never got a developer experience right? And so I thought, that's really a great question. And it's still, to a certain extent, it's a little bit baffling as to, how Kubernetes became as successful as it was, how it won out over things like Docker Swarm or Mesos and Marathon and some of the other things that were out there. And so I thought what I would do is sort of in the same vein as we've done sort of lessons learned from other technologies, sort of having lived through it, and I kind of give my perspective on how Kubernetes got to the point it was. without some of those things being at the center of its success. So we'll dig into that right after the break. Today's show is sponsored by CloudZero. For software-driven companies focused on growing margins, CloudZero is the only cloud cost intelligence platform that puts engineering in control by connecting technical decisions to business results. By analyzing cloud services like AWS and Snowflake, CloudZero provides real-time cost insights that help you maximize margins. Engineering teams can answer critical questions like, who are my most expensive customers? How much does this specific feature cost our business? What's the cost impact of re-architecting this application? With cost anomaly alerts via Slack, product-specific data views, and granular engineering context that makes it easy to investigate any cost, CloudZero is your complete cloud cost intelligence platform, connecting the dots between high-level trends and individual line items. Join companies like Drift, Rapid7, and SeatGeek by visiting cloudzero.com/cloudcast to get started today. That's cloudzero.com/cloudcast. Today's sponsor is Datadog, a real-time monitoring platform that unifies metrics, logs, and distributed traces from your cloud containers and orchestration software. Datadog's container-centric monitoring features allow you to track the health and performance of your dynamic container environment. The Container Map provides a bird's-eye view of your container fleet, and the Live Container View searches, groups, and filters your containers with any criteria, like tags, pods, or workspaces. To start monitoring your container clusters, sign up for a free trial today, and Datadog will send you a free t-shirt. Visit datadog.com/container-cloudcast to get started. That's datadog.com/container-cloudcast. And we're back. And, as mentioned at the top of the show, those two things really kind of, I've been trying to sort of figure out how to connect the dots because I thought, the good folks over at Software Defined Talk had a nice conversation about it, and Cote's comments again kind of resonated with me. How did Kubernetes end up succeeding? Because on one hand, Kubernetes didn't invent Docker; they didn't invent containers. That was sort of, it was a Docker thing, and you could argue containers had been around for a little while, but Docker was, really, had built this enormous community, and then you had, some other viable technologies that could run, cloud native types of applications, in some cases containerized applications that were out there, before Kubernetes came along. So to a certain extent, you had Cloud Foundry, which obviously, was different technology under the covers, but, had developed a very, well-defined, opinionated way of building, particularly Java applications, but, was out there and was viable. You had Mesosphere and Mesos and Marathon, which were out there in, large environments, a lot of big companies, Apple and many others, Netflix and others who were using it in production for, in many cases, their big data applications. You had Docker, beginning to roll out Swarm. So they were, trying to sort of take the Docker approach of let's make things simple and very developer friendly, extend that out to a container orchestration system in Swarm. And so, it sort of begs the question, right? If there was a way to, to build sort of opinionated Java applications, if there was kind of a way to, be developer friendly with containers already, and there was one something for big data, how did Kubernetes ever end up winning? How did that thing happen? And, I wrote the thing, and I'm going to kind of walk through my thought process, but I wrote a thing, on one of the Slack channels that I follow, kind of how I think it happened. And again, people can have differing opinions. I think, in general, this is sort of what happened in the market. But again, some of my viewpoint may end up being biased by having worked, in this space, but was working with a specific product. But anyways, I think the first thing that came to mind was, Mesos, Cloud Foundry, and Swarm, to a certain extent, not completely, but to a certain extent, were all more or less sort of single vendor dominated open source projects, right? Mesosphere essentially dominated Mesos project, although again, there were people like Apple and Netflix and others. They weren't huge contributors to the project; they were users. Cloud Foundry was very much dominated by Pivotal, although IBM and a few others were contributing, but Pivotal was the dominant player, and obviously Docker was the dominant player in the Swarm community. So I think, to a certain extent, there was market concern about, hey, this trend is definitely happening. We're seeing people using containers and building new types of applications, but do we want to go through yet another kind of iteration within our industry of something being, single vendor, right? And again, that argument, can be made, in a good way, hey, single vendors tend to build, highly integrated types of offerings. On the flip side, when you're dealing with an open source project, do you want it to be dominated by, a single, kind of company or single leader, benevolent dictator, if you will? So I think there was some customer concern about that, or market concern about that. And that gave an opening to something like Kubernetes that, came out and said, hey, yes, we originated with Google, but we are going to be a open project. We are going to have an open foundation that will drive the governance of it. And, there was a number of both companies, but individual developers that got involved early on, whether it was Red Hat or CoreOS or Microsoft or others, that kind of gave the market some sense of, okay, well, whether or not this technology is the right one, at least it seems to have a little more diversity of, who has a say in it, right? The second one was, I think Mesos, for the most part, was kind of focused entirely or primarily on big data and analytics. And there's nothing wrong with that. That was sort of its origin of where it came from, having come from out of university research. The downside to that was, if you were a company that was wanting to, say, run Java applications or something else, Python or Ruby or whatever, you weren't running big data types of applications. In order to be able to, the way that the Mesos worked in working with things like Marathon and other, kind of frameworks, application frameworks on top of Mesos, you had to kind of grab the framework for the application that you were building. And so it wasn't necessarily designed to be a general purpose, kind of container orchestrator. It was very much, designed to focus on a subset of use cases. And obviously, data and analytics is a huge portion of the market in terms of volume and capacity, but it wasn't necessarily something that was going to be the easiest thing in the world to get other types of common business applications maybe running, right? So it had a little bit of nichiness. And what's interesting is, if you go back and you look at kind of the framework that's built on top of Mesos, so things like Marathon and others, the Kubernetes community eventually kind of copied that with with CRDs and so forth. So but at the time, I think there was a certain amount of, okay, well, do I want to create a new silo of this? And Kubernetes actually did a reasonably good job, at least from day one, of supporting kind of a broad set of types of use cases that could be brought, to this scheduler, if you will. So it wasn't all of them. Obviously, a lot evolved, but that was another thing I think that you heard from people in the community and different companies and so forth about why Kubernetes might be a choice for them. The third thing was Swarm was interesting technology. It was, very embedded in the sort of Docker experience, Docker desktop experience, and so forth. But it wasn't terribly scalable, right? The original version of it was very peer-to-peer, and then they had to sort of rewrite it and build it in a more scalable way. And by the time they started writing it in a more scalable way, Kubernetes had sort of come along and been like, hey, we're kind of giving you Google scale by default. Now, not fully Google scale, but, hundreds and thousands of nodes that could be scheduled and managed versus, a smaller number with Swarm. So there were companies who were, liked some of the integration that Swarm did. Again, it kind of fit that Docker, Apple centric, not Apple the company, but sort of, all integrated approach. But the scale of it didn't necessarily work. So if you were going to bring a big data application to it, maybe Swarm wasn't going to be on your checklist, right? So you had these other projects, and they were, interesting in their own right, but maybe weren't open enough or weren't flexible enough for a broad set of use cases or scalable enough. And it opened up enough opportunities for folks to say, maybe I will consider an alternative, where that alternative was Kubernetes. Now, the other thing, so Kubernetes comes along, and it's sort of this good enough platform. It's not dominated by a single vendor, and it has some flexibility. And there's an interesting sort of Hacker News article that came out not too long ago, kind of after the documentary came out. And Joe Beda being one of the original creators of the project when he was at Google, eventually went on to start Heptio, which got sold to VMware. And he said, you could use it natively, or you could build some, sort of platform-like things on top of Kubernetes. So, to a certain extent, there was at least a promise or a hope that this thing could be very container centric, but it could also, be the foundation for something that could be more PaaS-y, right? Sort of PaaS, if you will. And, if you go back to the 2013, 2014, 2015 days when this was getting started, even 2016, PaaS was, considered a viable thing, right? Cloud Foundry was a real thing. And, Heroku was a real thing. And people were like, maybe PaaS is the way to do things for developers. So, again, you have this, kind of, hey, maybe it's good enough and maybe it could be evolved to do other things. And so I think when you think about all those things, it sort of lays the foundation for why Kubernetes became successful. Now, you could argue, we're still at a stage in 2022 where Kubernetes has become very successful in terms of a lot of different metrics, right? We see it's essentially kind of won the container orchestration wars, right? Mesosphere, eventually adopted Kubernetes. Docker sort of had to eventually adopt Kubernetes. Cloud Foundry moved, from being its own company, or Pivotal to moving over to VMware. It's kind of become part of the Kubernetes thing. So the Kubernetes piece of it has sort of won out in terms of, the other technologies aren't really being invested in. By other metrics, we see by most survey data that we get back from, what the market's doing, a lot of companies are using Kubernetes. Now, some are obviously much more mature than others, but we do see, broad adoption. We do see use cases and success stories from companies in, nearly every industry and from every part of the world. And we see, success at different scale, right? So some are using thousands of nodes and, some are using, a few hundred or a few tens or so forth. But, if you're in the container space and you're trying to build your applications in which containers are going to be the packaging and delivery mechanism, from those perspectives, Kubernetes has sort of, won or is successful. We've seen, quite a bit of VC investment. We've seen quite a bit of, M&A activities around things that were Kubernetes, whether they are, direct Kubernetes distribution, so like a Core OS or something. But we've seen a lot around security. We've seen cloud services get started, all those sort of things. So from that perspective, it's become a very, healthy, robust ecosystem. There are a lot of different options for customers in the market, whether they want to do things themselves, whether they want to buy software distributions, whether they want to consume managed services, all that kind of stuff. Now, it still does come back and beg the question, how is it continue to be successful if its goal is to help developers be successful, and there's not sort of one definitive developer experience? And I think to a certain extent, you kind of have to, what's the best way to explain it? You kind of have to suspend belief a little bit, or suspend the idea that in order for it to be successful, it has to have a defined experience, right? And I think if you look at it, one of the things with Kubernetes, and this has been part of its success and part of the frustration for people, is Kubernetes in a lot of cases hasn't defined a lot of things. They've sort of allowed the market to, or the community around it to try different stuff, right? There are multiple installers for how Kubernetes works. There are multiple ways, it's kind of narrowed down, but multiple ways to, do networking, to do storage, to do, bring a service mesh to it, or other things like that. So, part of the success of Kubernetes has been that, it didn't fall into the trap that happens with PaaS platforms, in which, it's good enough until it's not good enough, and then you get frustrated and you start over. It's given a lot of different organizations a lot of flexibility. And I think that's part of its success. It does beg the question of, will there ever be kind of a canonical, not from the company canonical, but kind of a, well-defined or a well-opinionated or a well-adopted, way of building on Kubernetes that's not YAML? And, I think the answer to that is probably maybe, right? We may see, certain companies kind of push an approach. I mean, we've seen things like Helm, we've seen operators, VMware now has, Tanzu application platform, which, kind of brings some of the Cloud Foundry-like opinionation, kind of PaaS-like opinionation to it. We've seen OpenShift from Red Hat do a number of things that are somewhat PaaS-like without being fully PaaS-like, but again, opinions with some flexibility. And then we've seen, a lot of companies that are building, different types of tooling, and we've talked about that on previous shows. So, I think that the hardest thing, as I've had listened to Cote on a number of episodes of SDT and another number of shows, I think he had kind of come from the perspective of, hey, I'm working on Cloud Foundry. We've seen success with sort of an opinionated thing. The other approach doesn't make sense for me. And I think the only way to sort of logically make sense of it is it's okay that there's not a lot of opinionation, right? The other underlying aspects of Kubernetes kind of won the day, and it still leaves the door open for somebody or multiple people, multiple companies, multiple offerings to come in and be that definitive, developer experience. And I think the other thing that sometimes is confusing about this, and again, I don't know it for complete fact, but I know from having talked to a lot of companies, the idea of saying what's the developer experience does limit things a little bit. And here, let me give you an example. So, in the case of, back in the PaaS days, again, any PaaS, they always were somewhat opinionated, but then they were also somewhat opinionated for a distinct, oftentimes language set or framework, right? So, it could be around Spring Boot, it could be around Ruby, it could be around Python, it could be around whatever. And I think at least what I've seen in the marketplace and having talked to a lot of different, implementers of this stuff, the problem that people have is that there is no one developer experience because, there's going to be developers that use different tools, that use different languages and different frameworks. So you almost have to think about, if I want to build a great developer experience, and if Kubernetes happens to be under the covers, what am I doing it for? And if you're trying to do it for, let's say, Java applications, that's fine. You can probably be really successful doing that with a certain approach. But there's also the flip side of that, which is you're probably not going to be terribly successful trying to take that exact same approach and saying, well, data scientist with your, Python and Jupyter notebooks and, TensorFlow or whatever else you're doing, that's probably not going to exactly work. And if I try and force that Java-centric opinion on you, you're going to likely go, well, I don't want to use your platform because it doesn't allow me to do what I want. And so maybe the answer to this, will there be a great Kubernetes experience, is going to be, can you build a great experience for a certain language or a certain framework or a certain whatever, but do it in a way that, in essence, it becomes kind of a modular plugin, similar to the way that Kubernetes today does CSI and CNI for container network interface or container storage interface. Maybe there needs to be sort of like a, again, this is just spitballing ideas, but like a CDI, a container developer interface, in which case, a VMware could plug in the Tanzu approach that is, Java-centric or Spring-centric, and then it could live right next to somebody who goes, hey, I built an approach that is, data science specific, or I built one that is, around a certain framework and stack, or it's, mobile-centric or something. Maybe that's the approach. I don't know that we necessarily need a container developer interface the way that we did for networking that has, sort of specific things. But maybe that's the mindset that kind of has to happen of, Kubernetes is a platform that was designed to be the framework or the foundation for then building subsequent higher level frameworks. And what that it means by definition is there's not going to be one. And that's okay, right? So, I think as I think about this and I kind of go through my notes as I was kind of trying to rationalize the really good question that Cote had, which was, how did it get so popular if it didn't meet one of its main objectives? And I think the only way to come back and think about it is it met its objectives because the way that it solves objectives or solves problems is not to come up with one answer, but to come up with the ability to have multiple answers, which I know sounds crazy if we were doing math or, trying to be rational. But I think that's kind of the only way to kind of rationalize not only how it became successful, but that modularity, that flexibility was at the core of its success. And even though that does maybe make the system harder than other systems, it then also at the end of the day allows company A or group B or whatever to go, I built the thing the way that we need it to be. And it might be different than group C or group D did it, but that worked for us. And how group C or group D did it is going to work for them. And the fact that they aren't exactly the same, but they're still sort of Kubernetes and containers under the covers is, proof that the system worked as it was expected. It's not perfect. It's not always utterly elegant, but it took advantage of sort of what it was designed to do, even though that may not always fit into kind of a perfect plan or a single way of doing things. So anyways, that's kind of how I rationalized it. That's kind of how I got myself to the point of going, it is where it is in the market. And if you look at how it's used in the market, that's kind of how it is. So, I'd love to hear other people who are living in the, Kubernetes community or implementing things on Kubernetes, sort of why you chose it and, what you do with it. We'd love to kind of get your feedback on stuff. If you want to come on and talk about it, we'd love to hear it. But, from a perspective, Sunday perspective, if you will, that was kind of how I rationalized my way of thinking through, okay, how do we get to this point, given all the different things that were both impedances to Kubernetes success and other things that may need to evolve over time. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Thanks to everybody for listening. Thanks for, as always, listening to the Sunday Perspective Show. I've gotten a lot of really nice feedback about folks saying, we love the interview shows, but it's nice to have a change of pace and to dive into some of these topics and just sort of have some opinion. So continue to enjoy doing them. Thanks as always for listening. Thanks for giving us feedback. We've gotten lots of feedback. We appreciate the 5 stars. It always helps us move up some of the rankings, which means that sometimes new people are going to find the show, which helps us grow the community. So any chance you get to give us feedback, especially if it's 5 stars, not only does it, strokes our ego a little bit, but more importantly, it just makes the show more visible, and that helps us grow the community, and that helps us, teach some people and share some knowledge and so forth. So you're doing good. Any chance you do in giving us that feedback. So I'm going to wrap it up, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.